Hey class, my name is Adam Tinsley, and I'm going to be presenting Chapter 7 of Johnston, Behavior Responsibility. Key terms from this chapter. So these are the terms that pop up over and over and over again, and we really need to know the definitions of them in order to get through the chapter efficiently. So the first term is verbal community. Verbal community is a social environment that maintains verbal contingencies for its members. Second term, verbal repertoire. All of the verbal behaviors a person can perform in a setting or a task. Reinforcement contingencies. Relationship between operant responses and their consequences that increase responding. And lastly, operant behavior. Behavior that is susceptible to manipulation by its consequences. First subheading, creativity. Key points. Creativity. The behavior we label creative depends on the familiarity we have with that specific behavior. Creativity is not a useful term to describe behavior because there are only subjective measurements of what we deem to be considered creative. When one refers to a behavior as creative, they often lack the relevant operant history to contextualize that behavior. For example, if a student of mine paints a picture and I initially say, wow, that's creative, it's most likely because I haven't seen any types of representations of that picture before in my history. But if a student paints that same picture, let's say 3 weeks later, I'll probably recall that picture that another student painted 3 weeks prior to that. And I probably won't be as likely to call that behavior creative because I'm now familiar with that specific example in another setting. Creativity continue. Creativity is a result of the contingencies of reinforcement. Example, if you put rats in a cage, I know this might seem weird based off of that last example, but if you put rats in a cage with swings, ramps, boxes, and toy cars, then only reinforce them for emitting behaviors that you haven't seen before, or if you've yet to observe, then over time, those rats will produce new responses to the objects in that cage. That's based off of a study done by Baum in 2005. This suggests that creativity can really depend on what's being reinforced. So if you only reinforce an individual or an organism for things that you haven't seen before, then you're more than likely going to activate that notion of creativity because you're not familiar with it. Yet another example of how stimulus discrimination leads to a response, and then the stimulus change determines the frequency of that reoccurrence for that behavior. Credit where credit is due. Key point. Who or what deserves credit for a behavior? It is easy to ascribe behavior to the individual producing a response. However, we understand as budding behaviorists that behavior is a result of interactions with the environment and the history of those interactions with the environment. It is a mistake to credit behaviors to qualities or traits that you believe an individual possesses. Credit where credit is due continue. Key point. If a trait such as creativity comes from within the individual, how are teachers and family supposed to develop that skill, quality, or trait, especially if we can only reinforce the product, not the behavior that leads to the product? If we reinforce the product, are we going to get that desired product again? We probably need to think about reinforcing those behaviors in order to replicate some type of a product. So Johnston states that the common misunderstanding here is that we reinforce the person and not the behavior, which he posits is technically impossible. You can't reinforce the person, but you can reinforce the behavior of a person. Therefore, if you have a misunderstanding about what is to be reinforced, which would thereby strengthen the behavior, then it's strategically impractical to reproduce a desired outcome. Are we blameless? So this subheading really focuses on a deterministic slash free will view of behavior. Uh, so really pitting those things against each other, that's where they naturally sit anyway in philosophy. So the key points to this particular subheading: there is no inner person in anybody's head influencing behavior outcomes. There's no homunculus up here driving your behaviors. It's just not happening. Furthermore, Johnston casts aside the notion of blame because behavior rests on the contingencies of reinforcement. In other words, focus should be placed on changing inappropriate reinforcement consequences to appropriate ones. So if we are receiving behavior that is not appropriate, it's probably because the reinforcement consequences are maintaining that behavior. So if we change that reinforcement consequences to more appropriate responses, then we would then be trying to change that behavior. Additionally, focus should be placed on building healthy environments for all so that there are fewer reasons to use social constructs such as blame. It comes down to responsibility. Key points of this subheading. Although the mentalistic idea of personal responsibility does not have behavioral origins, we can still hold that the notion holds some practical application. So we just shouldn't throw away the notion of personal responsibility, although it's more of a mentalistic view. Although when there is too much emphasis placed on the notion of personal responsibility, most people don't look to identify the actual causes of behavior. For example, if a student is quote unquote acting up in my class and then getting a D, if I ascribe his behavior to the notion of personal responsibility, then he's responsible for changing his behavior so that he can get an A or B or more desired outcome. But I'm not likely then to look for the actual causes of the behavior or the reinforcement contingencies that are actually maintaining that behavior, because I believe that it's all on that person as opposed to the environment that person is operating in that's driving or maintaining, not driving, but maintaining that behavior. Conscious. This is the last subheading. The key points here are shame and guilt are socially mediated punishers, and shame and guilt have been conditioned to our automatic nervous system responses. So shame and guilt have been paired with our biological responses, and then that's how we experience shame and guilt. So the questions relevant to this chapter are these, or goes as follows. What are some of the implications if we do not hold people responsible for their behavior? Thanks for staying with me there. Second question. If behavior is a result of our interactions with our environment, are we truly responsible for our actions? And then lastly, what does it mean to say that a behavior is creative, according to Johnston? And how does that differ from your own notion of creativity? That concludes the presentation. Thanks for coming along this journey with me. Until next time.